Congratulations, you've just unlocked time travel. The good news is, you can visit any moment in history. The bad news is, your machine has a twisted sense of humor. It only takes you to disasters. Forget those romantic daydreams about sipping wine with Renaissance artists or chatting with ancient philosophers. Your temporal GPS is permanently stuck on history's greatest hits of human suffering. No golden ages, no peaceful moments, no quiet afternoons in beautiful gardens. Just ash, blood, panic, and the occasional exploding mountain. Before we calibrate the temporal drive, you might as well make a small offering to the algorithm. A tap of the like button is a good start, and if this is your kind of morbid tourism, consider subscribing to secure your ticket for future trips. For tonight's manifest, log your temporal and geographical coordinates in the comments below. Let me know where and when you're tuning in from. It's always fascinating to see our crew of historical observers materializing from around the globe. All right, find your temporal anchor point, that comfortable spot in your bed. Let the ambient noise of your own century fade into a low hum. Our journey tonight is purely observational. You'll witness history's worst moments from the safety of your own timeline, wrapped in blankets instead of ash clouds. Think of this as disaster tourism without the actual dying part. We'll explore what it would really be like to wake up in Pompeii on that fateful morning, to smell the smoke in medieval London, or to feel the ground shake beneath San Francisco. You'll experience history's most terrifying moments through the eyes of someone who knows exactly what's coming but can't change a thing. Ready to begin this morbid adventure through time? Let's start your disaster-only time travel experience. It's the year 79 AD, late summer in the shadow of Mount Vesuvius. Historians debate whether the day is August 24th, or perhaps sometime in October, but the exact date hardly matters. What does matter is that you've landed in Pompeii on the morning that will turn ordinary Roman life into one of history's most infamous tragedies. The morning air feels surprisingly normal. Citizens are going about their daily routines, completely unaware that they're living their final hours. You watch a baker sliding fresh loaves from his oven, the same oven that will soon be buried under 20 feet of volcanic debris. A wine merchant haggles with customers over prices, his voice carrying the casual irritation of someone who thinks his biggest problem is profit margins. Children run through the streets playing games you don't recognize, their laughter echoing off stone walls that have stood for centuries and will remain standing for nearly 2,000 more years, perfectly preserved under volcanic ash. A group of women gossip near a fountain, discussing local politics and neighborhood scandals that will become completely irrelevant in about 6 hours. The city bustles with about 15,000 people going about their Roman lives. You smell bread baking, hear the clatter of cartwheels on stone streets, and notice the casual luxury that made Pompeii a resort town for wealthy Romans. Elegant houses with intricate mosaics, public baths with heated floors, theaters where people gathered for entertainment they'll never finish watching. Then, around noon, Vesuvius clears his throat. The first sign isn't dramatic, just a small earthquake, the kind that happens regularly in this volcanic region. People pause, look around, then continue their conversations. They're used to the mountain's occasional grumbling. What they don't know is that this time, the mountain has something bigger to say. The eruption begins with a column of ash and pumice shooting 15 miles into the sky. It's actually quite beautiful at first, like a massive stone pine tree made of grey smoke. But beauty turns to terror when you realize the column is growing wider, darker, and starting to rain death onto the city below. The pumice falls like hail, but hail that accumulates rapidly and doesn't melt. Within hours, it's knee-deep in the streets. People try to sweep it away from their doorsteps, not understanding that this is just the opening act. The real show is still coming. You watch families make the fatal decision to stay indoors, thinking their roofs will protect them. Others grab whatever they can carry and flee toward the harbor, hoping to escape by sea. Some head for the roads leading away from the mountain, but they're fighting against a tide of volcanic debris that makes travel increasingly impossible. The air becomes difficult to breathe. Ash fills your lungs and stings your eyes. The sky darkens to an unnatural twilight, even though it's still afternoon. People cover their faces with cloth, but it doesn't help much. The ash is everywhere, coating everything in a grey blanket that turns the familiar city into an alien landscape. As evening approaches, the real nightmare begins. The volcanic column collapses, sending pyroclastic flows racing down the mountainside at speeds of over 60 miles per hour. These aren't just hot air and ash. They're superheated gas clouds reaching temperatures of over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to kill instantly through heat shock before the ash even has time to suffocate you. The flows hit Pompeii like invisible tsunamis of death. People caught outside are killed instantly, their bodies frozen in their final moments. A man trying to shield his face from the heat. A dog straining against its chain. A family huddled together in their final seconds. But here's what most people don't realize about Pompeii's preservation. The victims weren't turned to stone or fossilized in the traditional sense. The intense heat killed them instantly, and then the ash buried them, creating perfect molds around their bodies. Over centuries, the bodies decomposed, leaving hollow spaces in the hardened ash. When archaeologists discovered these spaces and filled them with plaster, they revealed the exact positions and expressions of Pompeii's final moments. You're witnessing the creation of history's most detailed snapshot of ancient daily life, preserved not by intention, but by catastrophe. The bread still in the ovens, the coins still in purses, the graffiti still on the walls. Pompeii becomes a time capsule, but one sealed by sudden death rather than careful planning. The eruption continues for hours, burying the city deeper and deeper. By the time it's over, Pompeii lies under 20 feet of volcanic material, completely hidden from view. It will stay buried for over 1,500 years, waiting for archaeologists to rediscover this perfectly preserved Roman city. Standing there in the ash-filled air, watching history's most famous natural disaster unfold, you realize you're seeing more than just a volcanic eruption. You're witnessing the moment when an ordinary day becomes an extraordinary tragedy, when routine life transforms into eternal preservation. The mountain that provided fertile soil for Pompeii's prosperity has just claimed the city as payment, creating an accidental museum that will teach future generations exactly how Romans lived and died. The irony isn't lost on you. Vesuvius destroyed Pompeii, but in destroying it, the volcano also saved it, creating the most detailed record of ancient Roman life that exists anywhere in the world. Welcome to 1347, where you've just checked into medieval Europe's most exclusive, all-inclusive plague experience. You've just arrived in a bustling port city, maybe Genoa or Marseille, just as 12 black ships dock in the harbour. The sailors stumbling off these vessels look terrible, covered in black boils and barely able to stand. Most are already dead. You're witnessing the Black Death's grand entrance to Europe, courtesy of trade routes that connected the world in ways medieval people never imagined. Those ships carried more than silk and spices from the east. They brought fleas, and those fleas carried Yersinia pestis, a bacterium with an appetite for human civilization. The city around you bustles with typical medieval energy. Merchants hawk their wares in narrow, filthy streets that double as open sewers. The smell hits you immediately, a mixture of human waste, rotting food, unwashed bodies, and animal dung that medieval noses had long since learned to ignore. Houses lean precariously over cobblestone streets, their upper floors nearly touching across the narrow passages, blocking out most of the sunlight. People crowd together in ways that would make a modern epidemiologist weep. Entire families share single rooms with their livestock. Public baths, where they exist, are communal affairs where dozens of people soak in the same increasingly murky water. Personal hygiene consists mainly of changing your outer clothes occasionally and maybe splashing some water on your face if you're feeling fancy. The good news is nobody knows what's coming. The bad news is you do. Within days, the first cases appear. A dock worker develops a fever and complains of aching joints. By the next morning, he's covered in black, egg-sized swellings called buboes that give the bubonic plague its name. These grotesque lumps appear in his armpits, groin, and neck, filled with infected lymph nodes that have swollen to the size of apples. Medieval medicine responds with the confidence of people who have no idea what they're dealing with. Doctors arrive wearing their distinctive plague masks, long, beak-like contraptions stuffed with aromatic herbs, believing that bad smells cause disease. They look like terrifying birds as they examine patients, poking at buboes with long sticks to avoid direct contact. The treatments they prescribe would be hilarious if they weren't so tragic. Bloodletting. Because obviously what a dying person needs is less blood. Burning aromatic herbs to purify the air. Prayers, lots of prayers, because surely God will intervene if you ask nicely enough. Some doctors recommend drinking your own urine or applying crushed emeralds to the buboes. Treatments that cost a fortune and accomplish nothing except enriching charlatans. Religious fanatics take a different approach. Groups of flagellants roam from town to town, whipping themselves bloody in public squares, believing that sufficient self-punishment will convince God to end the plague. Their processions become traveling infection festivals, spreading the disease faster than any merchant caravan ever could. You watch as the social fabric begins to unravel with terrifying speed. The plague doesn't discriminate. It kills peasants and nobles, priests and merchants, children and adults with equal enthusiasm. Entire families disappear within days. Houses stand empty, their doors marked with crosses to warn away the living. The death rate is staggering. In some cities, half the population dies within months. In others, it's closer to 90%. Bodies pile up faster than gravediggers can bury them, assuming the gravediggers are still alive to do the burying. Mass graves become common, with corpses stacked like cordwood and covered with lime. Daily life becomes a surreal dance with death. People wake up healthy and die before sunset. Children play in streets where bodies lie uncollected. Merchants continue trying to sell goods even as their customers literally drop dead while shopping. The economy doesn't gradually decline. It collapses overnight as entire professions simply cease to exist. The rats are everywhere, though nobody connects them to the disease. Medieval people blame everything except the actual cause. Corrupted air, angry gods, Jewish conspiracies, planetary alignments, or divine punishment for humanity's sins. They kill cats, thinking felines spread the plague, which only makes the rat problem worse and accelerates the disease's spread. You witness the breakdown of medieval society's careful hierarchies. Serfs abandon their lords' fields because there's no point in farming when you might die tomorrow. Priests flee their parishes, leaving the dying without last rites. Judges abandon their courts, merchants close their shops, and teachers dismiss their students permanently. The psychological impact is as devastating as the physical toll. Survivors develop a fatalistic worldview that will shape European culture for generations. Art becomes obsessed with death, featuring dancing skeletons and rotting corpses. Literature fixates on life's brevity and the inevitability of divine judgment. The phrase memento mori, remember you must die, becomes a cultural obsession. Some people respond to the apocalypse by becoming more religious, spending their final days in prayer and contemplation. Others go the opposite direction, embracing hedonistic pleasure-seeking because tomorrow might never come. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, becomes more than a saying. It becomes a survival strategy for maintaining sanity in an insane world. The plague's social effects create opportunities alongside the devastation. Labor becomes incredibly valuable when most of the laborers are dead. Surviving peasants can demand higher wages and better working conditions because lords have no choice but to agree. Some historians argue that the Black Death's demographic catastrophe ultimately helped end feudalism by making human labor too precious to waste on serfdom. You're watching 1/3 of Europe's population disappear in less than a decade. Entire bloodlines end abruptly. Villages are abandoned and never resettled. Knowledge accumulated over generations vanishes when the people carrying it die without passing it on. The plague doesn't just kill individuals, it murders entire communities, traditions, and ways of life. The irony of your time travel experience becomes clear as you witness this medieval apocalypse. You're seeing the disaster that, in killing so many people, ultimately helped create the modern world. The Black Death's devastation forced European society to rebuild itself along different lines, contributing to the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the eventual development of modern medicine and public health practices. Standing in a plague-ravaged medieval street, surrounded by the smell of death and the sound of mourning, you realize you're witnessing more than just a pandemic. You're seeing the violent birth pangs of modernity, the catastrophic transition between the medieval world and everything that came after. The Black Death didn't just kill people. It killed an entire way of understanding human existence and humanity's relationship with disease, death, and divine justice. September 2nd, 1666, and you've just materialized on Pudding Lane in the heart of London. It's past midnight, and most of the city sleeps peacefully, completely unaware that they're about to witness history's biggest insurance nightmare. You're standing outside Thomas Farriner's bakery, where the ovens are still warm from the day's bread making. In a few hours, those ovens will start the most expensive barbecue in British history. The London around you is a medieval tinderbox waiting for a spark. Houses lean against each other like drunken friends, their timber frames and thatched roofs creating perfect kindling. The streets are narrow passages barely wide enough for a cart, with upper floors jutting out so far they nearly touch across the gaps. It's charming in a rustic way, assuming you don't think too hard about fire safety. The city has been suffering through an unusually dry summer. No significant rain has fallen in months, turning London's wooden buildings into perfectly seasoned firewood. The Thames runs lower than usual, and even the normally damp English air feels crisp and dry. It's the kind of weather that makes fire marshals nervous, if fire marshals had existed in 1666. Around 2 a.m., something goes wrong in Farriner's bakery. Maybe a spark from the dying embers catches some nearby kindling. Maybe the baker forgot to properly bank his fire. The exact cause will be debated for centuries, but the result is undeniable. Flames begin licking at the wooden interior of the shop. The fire starts small, as most disasters do. A few flames dancing along wooden shelves, nothing that couldn't be stamped out with a wet cloth and some quick thinking. But this is 1666 London, where firefighting technology consists mainly of leather buckets and good intentions. By the time anyone notices the problem, the flames have spread beyond easy control. You watch as the fire discovers just how flammable medieval London really is. The bakery's timber frame catches quickly, and flames leap to neighbouring houses like an eager child hopping between stepping stones. The narrow streets that give London its cosy charm now become wind tunnels, funneling air to feed the growing inferno and carrying sparks to fresh fuel. The first residents to notice the fire try the traditional approach: bucket brigades passing water from the Thames. It's admirably organised but hopelessly inadequate. They're trying to fight a growing wildfire with what amounts to a garden sprinkler. The flames laugh at their efforts and continue spreading, house by house, street by street. London's firefighting strategy relies heavily on creating fire breaks by demolishing buildings in the fire's path. It's a sound principle, but it requires acting quickly and decisively. Unfortunately, the city's authorities spend precious hours debating property rights and compensation, while the fire spreads unchecked. By the time they authorize widespread demolition, the fire has grown too large and too fast for fire breaks to be effective. You witness the strange priorities people reveal during disasters. Some residents risk their lives trying to save heavy furniture while abandoning valuable but portable items. Others focus on rescuing their pets while leaving behind family heirlooms. A wealthy merchant spends hours trying to move a massive oak table while his house burns around him, apparently believing that furniture is harder to replace than his own life. The fire develops its own weather system as it grows. The intense heat creates powerful updrafts that suck in air from all directions, feeding the flames with fresh oxygen while simultaneously spreading burning debris across wider areas. Witnesses describe seeing flaming pieces of wood flying through the air like deadly confetti, starting new fires hundreds of yards away from the main blaze. By the second day, the fire has become a living monster consuming everything in its path. The flames roar so loudly that people can't hear each other speak even when shouting. The heat is so intense that it melts church bells and turns stone walls into lime. The smoke rises so high that people in Oxford, 50 miles away, can see the dark column staining the sky. The human drama unfolds in countless small tragedies. Families flee with whatever they can carry, often making terrible choices about what to save and what to abandon. Children cry for toys left behind while parents struggle with bundles of clothes and food. Elderly residents who can't move quickly enough are carried by neighbours, creating touching scenes of community solidarity amid the chaos. London's famous landmarks begin falling like dominoes. The Royal Exchange, where merchants conducted international business, becomes a pile of smouldering ruins. Guildhall, the centre of city government, sees its roof collapse in a shower of sparks. Even the mighty St. Paul's Cathedral, which had stood for centuries, succumbs to the flames when its wooden scaffolding catches fire and spreads to the ancient timbers of the roof. The fire spawns its own brutal marketplace. Carters with wagons demand premium prices for evacuation services. Thames boat owners charge desperate families everything they have for river crossings. Opportunistic merchants establish temporary markets, selling basic necessities at prices that transform survival into luxury. King Charles II himself joins the firefighting efforts, working alongside common citizens with buckets and axes. It's a rare moment of royal solidarity with his subjects, though his presence probably causes more excitement than practical help. The sight of their king covered in soot and ash, fighting the fire like a common labourer, creates stories that will be told for generations. The fire burns for 4 days, consuming roughly 13,200 houses, 87 churches, and most of the medieval city of London. When it finally dies out, more from lack of fuel than human intervention, it leaves behind a landscape that looks like a war zone. Entire neighbourhoods have vanished, reduced to ash and blackened stone foundations. But here's the twisted irony of this disaster. The Great Fire of London was probably the best thing that ever happened to the city. The medieval London that burned was overcrowded, unsanitary, and disease-ridden. The Great Plague had killed thousands just the year before, thriving in the cramped, filthy conditions of the old city. The fire cleared away centuries of accumulated urban problems, creating space for Christopher Wren's magnificent churches and a more rationally planned city layout. The new London that rose from the ashes featured wider streets, better building materials, and improved sanitation. In destroying the old city, the fire made possible a newer, healthier, more beautiful London. Standing in the smoke-filled streets, watching centuries of history turn to ash, you realize you're witnessing creative destruction on an urban scale. Sometimes disasters don't just destroy, they perform urban surgery, cutting away the infected past to make room for a healthier future. April 14th, 1912, and you've just stepped aboard the RMS Titanic, the most luxurious floating palace ever constructed. The ship stretches nearly 3 football fields long and rises 11 stories high, a testament to human engineering and hubris in equal measure. You're standing on the deck of what everyone calls the unsinkable ship, and you know exactly how wrong they are. The luxury surrounding you is almost overwhelming. First-class passengers stroll past wearing clothes that cost more than most people earn in a year. The ship's grand staircase sweeps dramatically between decks, carved from solid oak and topped with an ornate glass dome. Electric lights illuminate every corridor. A marvel in 1912, when most homes still relied on gas or oil lamps. The ship even has its own newspaper, printed fresh each morning with news received by wireless telegraph. But the real story of the Titanic isn't just about luxury. It's about class divisions, so rigid they persist even in the face of death. You notice how the ship is essentially 3 separate worlds stacked on top of each other. First-class passengers enjoy palatial suites with private promenades, a la carte restaurant, and a swimming pool. Second-class accommodations rival the first-class offerings on most other ships. Third-class passengers, mostly immigrants seeking new lives in America, are packed into the ship's lower decks with basic amenities, but still better conditions than they'd find on most vessels. The crew moves through this floating city with practiced efficiency. Stewards attend to every passenger whim. Stokers shovel coal in the blazing heat of the engine rooms, and officers maintain the ship's course across the North Atlantic. Everyone has their place in this carefully orchestrated hierarchy, and everyone believes they're part of something unprecedented and safe. The arrogance is palpable. Passengers joke about the ship's unsinkable reputation, making light of the very real dangers of North Atlantic crossings. The ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, walks the decks with quiet pride, checking details and making notes for future improvements he'll never get to implement. Captain Edward Smith, on his final voyage before retirement, commands with the confidence of someone who's crossed these waters dozens of times without incident. You spend the day observing this floating microcosm of Edwardian society. Wealthy industrialists conduct business deals in the smoking room, while their wives gossip in the first-class lounge. Children from well-to-do families play elaborate games under their nanny's watchful eyes. In third class, families huddle together, sharing dreams of American opportunities while trying to make their limited food supplies last the journey. The ship's amenities seem designed to make passengers forget they're at sea. The Café Parisien offers French cuisine in a setting that mimics a sidewalk bistro. The Turkish bath provides exotic relaxation for those who can afford it. The gymnasium features the latest exercise equipment, including a rowing machine and stationary bicycles. It's as if the designers wanted to create a floating piece of civilization that just happened to cross oceans. As evening approaches on April 14th, the temperature drops noticeably. Ice warnings have been coming in all day via wireless, but the ship maintains its speed. There's pressure to arrive in New York on schedule, and besides, what could possibly threaten the unsinkable Titanic? The wireless operators are too busy sending personal messages for wealthy passengers to pay much attention to ice warnings from other ships. You watch the sunset over calm seas that look deceptively peaceful. The ocean stretches endlessly in all directions. Dark blue water that seems solid and safe. There's no wind, which creates an unusual phenomenon. Without waves lapping against icebergs, they become nearly invisible in the darkness. It's the kind of night that looks beautiful, but hides deadly surprises. The evening entertainment proceeds normally. The ship's orchestra performs in the first-class lounge, while passengers dance and socialize. Card games continue late into the night in the smoking room. Most passengers retire to their cabins feeling satisfied with another day of luxury travel, completely unaware that they have less than 2 hours left to live. At 11:40 p.m., lookout Frederick Fleet spots something dark looming ahead. He rings the crow's nest bell 3 times and telephones the bridge with words that will echo through history. Iceberg right ahead. First Officer William Murdoch orders hard a starboard and full astern, trying desperately to avoid collision. For 37 agonizing seconds, it seems like the ship might clear the ice. But physics and momentum have other plans. The iceberg scrapes along the starboard side, opening the ship's hull like a can opener working through metal. The impact feels surprisingly gentle to most passengers, just a slight shudder and grinding noise that many mistake for the ship passing over debris. Some passengers even come on deck to examine chunks of ice that have fallen onto the lower decks, treating them like curious souvenirs. The ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, conducts a quick inspection and delivers the death sentence. Titanic will sink within an hour or two. The ship was designed to survive flooding in 4 compartments, but the iceberg has breached 6. Mathematics doesn't care about human confidence or engineering pride. The ship is doomed, and so are most of the people aboard. Captain Smith orders the lifeboats uncovered, but here's where the disaster becomes a tragedy of poor planning and social prejudice. Titanic carries lifeboats for only 1,178 people, less than half the souls aboard. The regulations haven't kept pace with ship sizes, and besides, who needs lifeboats on an unsinkable ship? The evacuation reveals the rigid class system in its most brutal form. First-class passengers are escorted to boat stations, while third-class passengers are literally locked below decks by gates designed to prevent steerage passengers from wandering into first-class areas. When these gates are finally opened, many third-class passengers can't find their way through the ship's maze-like layout to reach the boat deck. You witness the famous women and children first policy, but it's applied inconsistently and often along class lines. First-class women and children are helped into lifeboats, while third-class families are still trying to reach the deck. Some lifeboats launch half empty because officers fear overcrowding, even as hundreds of people remain trapped on the sinking ship. The ship's orchestra continues playing as the deck tilts increasingly toward the sea. Their final song remains disputed. Some survivors claim it was the hymn "Nearer, My God, to Thee," while others insist it was a popular ragtime tune. What's certain is that these 8 musicians play until the very end, providing a soundtrack to disaster that becomes one of history's most poignant images of grace under pressure. As the ship's angle increases, the carefully maintained illusion of civilization collapses. Furniture slides across tilting decks, china crashes in dining rooms, and the massive engines break free from their moorings, crashing through bulkheads with thunderous noise. The lights flicker, but remarkably stay on almost until the end, thanks to heroic engineers who remain at their post to keep the power running. The final moments are chaos and terror. The ship breaks apart with a sound like thunder, sending hundreds of people into water so cold it kills within minutes. The screams of the dying carry across the calm sea, haunting the survivors in lifeboats who row away from the suction they fear will drag them down. Standing on the deck of this doomed palace, watching hubris meet reality in the North Atlantic darkness, you realize you're witnessing more than just a maritime disaster. You're seeing the end of an era of unlimited confidence in human progress and technology. The Titanic's sinking becomes a metaphor for the fragility of civilization itself, a reminder that nature doesn't care about human pride or engineering achievements. The unsinkable ship sinks in less than 3 hours, taking 1,500 people with it, and leaving behind a story that will fascinate and horrify people for more than a century. February 10th, 1258, and you've just arrived in Baghdad, the intellectual crown jewel of the Islamic world. The city sprawls along the banks of the Tigris River like a vast library made of stone and clay, home to nearly 2 million people and centuries of accumulated human knowledge. You're standing in what many consider the most learned city on earth, and you know that in 3 days, most of it will be ash. The Baghdad around you pulses with scholarly energy that would make modern universities weep with envy. The House of Wisdom dominates the city's intellectual landscape, its halls filled with manuscripts that represent the collected knowledge of Greek philosophy, Persian mathematics, Indian astronomy, and Islamic theology. Scholars from across the known world have gathered here for generations, translating, debating, and expanding human understanding in ways that won't be matched for centuries. You walk through streets lined with libraries, scriptoriums, and schools, where the world's greatest minds pursue knowledge with religious devotion. The air itself seems thick with learning. You hear Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and a dozen other languages as scholars debate everything from Aristotelian logic to advanced algebra. These aren't just academic exercises. This is where humanity stores its intellectual treasures, where the wisdom of ages accumulates like sediment in a riverbed. The Mongol army surrounding the city represents a different kind of human achievement, the perfection of organized destruction. Hulagu Khan's forces stretch beyond the horizon, a sea of horsemen and siege engines that have already conquered most of Asia. These aren't mindless barbarians, despite what European chroniclers will later claim. They're methodical, disciplined, and terrifyingly efficient at dismantling civilizations. The siege has been underway for weeks, but the real horror is still coming. You watch as Mongol engineers position their siege engines with mathematical precision, turning warfare into applied physics. Their catapults and mangonels represent cutting-edge military technology, designed to breach walls that have protected Baghdad for centuries. The irony isn't lost on you. They're using advanced engineering to destroy the very place where much of that engineering knowledge was preserved and developed. Inside the city, daily life continues with the desperate normalcy of people trying to maintain routine while their world crumbles. Scholars still gather in libraries, discussing philosophical questions, as if they have unlimited time to reach conclusions. Students copy manuscripts by candlelight, preserving knowledge they don't yet realize is about to vanish forever. Families share meals and tell stories, creating final memories in rooms that will soon be rubble. The city's defenders know they're facing something unprecedented. Previous conquerors had been content to rule Baghdad and exploit its wealth. The Mongols offer something different: complete surrender or total annihilation. There's no middle ground, no negotiated settlement, no face-saving compromise. Submit completely or watch everything burn. Caliph al-Mustasim, the last Abbasid Caliph, makes the fatal decision to resist. It's a choice born of pride, religious conviction, and a complete failure to understand what he's facing. He believes Allah will protect the center of Islamic learning, that surely God won't allow the destruction of so much accumulated wisdom. He's about to discover that the Mongols don't negotiate with divine providence. February 13th arrives with the inevitability of a natural disaster. The Mongol assault begins at dawn, and Baghdad's walls, which have stood for centuries, crumble under the methodical bombardment. You watch as disciplined Mongol units pour through the breaches, moving with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine designed for urban destruction. What follows isn't random violence, it's systematic annihilation. The Mongols don't just kill people, they erase the very concept of Baghdad as a center of learning. Libraries that took centuries to build are stripped of their manuscripts, which are then used as kindling for cooking fires or simply thrown into the Tigris River. Scholars who spent lifetimes accumulating knowledge are slaughtered alongside their books, creating a double death of both wisdom and the minds that contained it. The House of Wisdom becomes a particular target for destruction. Manuscripts that represent the only copies of ancient Greek texts, Persian poetry, and Islamic philosophy are systematically destroyed. You watch centuries of human intellectual achievement turn to smoke in a matter of hours. The Mongols don't just conquer Baghdad, they perform surgery on human civilization, cutting out one of its most vital organs. The destruction is so thorough that witnesses claim the Tigris River runs black with ink from destroyed manuscripts and red with blood from murdered scholars. It's probably an exaggeration, but it captures the psychological impact of watching knowledge itself become a casualty of war. This isn't just urban destruction, it's intellectual genocide on a scale that won't be matched until the 20th century. You witness the death of individuals who represent irreplaceable libraries of human knowledge. Master calligraphers whose skills took decades to develop are killed in minutes. Mathematicians who understood concepts that won't be rediscovered for centuries die alongside their calculations. Physicians whose medical knowledge could have saved thousands of lives are murdered before they can pass on their learning. The Mongols show particular creativity in destroying what they can't understand. Astronomical instruments are melted down for their metal. Elaborate geometric decorations are chiseled off buildings and discarded. Musical instruments are broken apart and used as firewood. It's as if they're systematically erasing not just a city, but an entire way of thinking about human knowledge and artistic expression. The siege lasts only a few days, but its effects will echo for centuries. Baghdad, which had been the intellectual center of the Islamic world for over 500 years, never fully recovers. The city that once rivaled Constantinople and Cordoba as a beacon of learning becomes a provincial backwater. Its role as a center of scholarship permanently ended. Standing in the smoke-filled ruins of what was once humanity's greatest library, you realize you're witnessing more than just military conquest. You're seeing the moment when human progress suffers one of its greatest setbacks, when centuries of accumulated wisdom vanish in days of systematic destruction. The Mongol destruction of Baghdad represents the dark side of human efficiency. The same organizational skills that built empires and advanced knowledge can also erase civilizations with terrifying completeness. You're watching knowledge die, and with it, possibilities that will never be recovered. January 15th, 1919, Boston's North End, and what appears to be a perfectly ordinary winter afternoon is about to become America's stickiest nightmare. The temperature is unusually warm for January, around 40 degrees, which should have been your first warning that this day would be anything but ordinary. You're standing near a massive steel tank that looms over the neighborhood like an industrial monument, filled with over 2 million gallons of molasses. In about 10 minutes, that tank is going to turn this quiet residential area into the most American disaster imaginable. The North End bustles with typical working-class energy. Italian immigrants have made this neighborhood their own, filling the streets with the sounds of children playing, mothers calling from tenement windows, and the general chaos of urban life in the early 20th century. The elevated railway rumbles overhead, carrying commuters between downtown Boston and the outer neighborhoods. Workers from nearby factories walk home for lunch, completely unaware they're about to witness something so bizarre that people will struggle to believe it actually happened. The molasses tank belongs to the Purity Distilling Company, though there's nothing pure about what's about to occur. The tank stands 50 feet tall and 90 feet in diameter, a hastily constructed steel cylinder that was built more for capacity than safety. Local residents have complained for years about the tank leaking, leaving sticky brown trails down its sides and creating a permanent sweet smell that permeates the neighborhood. You notice the warning signs that everyone else ignores. The tank creaks and groans in the warming air as the molasses inside expands with the temperature change. Steel rivets strain against forces they weren't designed to handle. The tank was built quickly during World War I to meet increased demand for industrial alcohol, and corners were cut in ways that would make modern engineers weep. No architect reviewed the design, no stress tests were performed, and the steel walls are barely half as thick as they should be for a container this size. At 12:30 p.m., physics finally wins its argument with poor engineering. The tank doesn't just leak, it explodes with the force of a bomb. The steel walls burst apart, releasing a tsunami of molasses that stands 25 feet high and moves at 35 miles per hour through the narrow streets. You're witnessing the birth of the most surreal natural disaster in American history. A wave of syrup that's about to demonstrate that viscous liquids can be just as deadly as any flood. The sound is indescribable. Part explosion, part roar, part the world's largest breakfast being prepared. 2 million gallons of molasses doesn't flow like water. It moves like a living brown mountain, crushing everything in its path with the weight of liquid concrete. The wave is so massive and moves so fast that people don't have time to process what they're seeing, let alone run away from it. You watch in horrified fascination as the molasses wave demolishes everything in its path. A firehouse collapses instantly, trapping firefighters inside. The elevated railway support structure buckles and twists as if made of paper. Horses pulling delivery wagons are swept away, their terrified screams mixing with the sounds of crushing wood and screaming people. Buildings that have stood for decades crumble like sandcastles, hit by a tide of brown death. The human drama unfolds in slow-motion horror. People try to run, but molasses at this temperature has the consistency of wet concrete. Those caught in the wave find themselves trapped in a substance that's too thick to swim through, but too liquid to climb out of. Children playing in the street disappear beneath the brown surface. Workers walking home for lunch are engulfed before they can even understand what's happening. The physics of the disaster create uniquely American ironies. This is molasses, the sweetest of substances, transformed into an instrument of destruction. The same ingredient that makes cookies and candies delicious is now suffocating people and crushing buildings. It's as if the industrial age decided to kill people with dessert ingredients, creating a disaster that sounds like a dark comedy sketch, but delivers a very real death. The cleanup becomes almost as surreal as the disaster itself. Molasses doesn't wash away with water, it just becomes stickier. The city has to use salt water from Boston Harbor, which helps dissolve the mess, but creates a sticky, salty sludge that coats everything for blocks. Rescue workers struggle to move through knee-deep molasses that grabs at their boots and makes every step an exhausting effort. For weeks afterward, the entire North End reeks of molasses. The smell seeps into buildings, clothes, and hair. People track sticky footprints throughout the city, creating a trail of evidence that leads back to the disaster site. On hot summer days for years to come, residents claim they can still smell the faint sweetness of molasses rising from sidewalks and buildings. The final toll is 21 dead and 150 injured, victims of what becomes known as the Great Molasses Flood. The disaster leads to significant changes in building safety standards and engineering oversight, proving that sometimes it takes a ridiculous tragedy to force serious reforms. Standing in the aftermath of this sticky apocalypse, watching rescue workers struggle through brown quicksand to reach survivors, you realize you've witnessed the most uniquely American disaster possible. Death by industrial dessert ingredient, delivered with the efficiency of modern manufacturing and the safety standards of the 19th century. June 30th, 1908, deep in the Siberian wilderness near the Podkamennaya Tunguska River, where you're about to witness the universe's most violent wake-up call. The forest stretches endlessly in all directions, a sea of pine and birch trees that seems to go on forever. You're standing in one of the most isolated places on Earth, where the nearest human settlement is dozens of miles away, and the indigenous Evenki people move through the landscape like ghosts, following reindeer herds and ancient traditions. The morning air is crisp and clean, in a way that modern lungs have forgotten how to process. No industrial pollution, no car exhaust, no chemical smells, just the pure scent of pine needles, moss, and the earthy richness of untouched wilderness. Birds call from the canopy above, and somewhere in the distance you hear the crack of a branch as some large animal moves through the underbrush. This is nature at its most pristine, a landscape that looks exactly as it did 1,000 years ago. The trees grow in dense stands, their trunks straight and tall, reaching toward a sky so blue it almost hurts to look at. Streams wind through the forest, their water so clear you can count pebbles on the bottom. It's the kind of wilderness that makes you understand why people talk about the healing power of nature. At exactly 7:17 a.m. local time, the sky explodes. The first sign isn't visual, it's a sound like the world ending. A roar that seems to come from everywhere at once, louder than thunder, louder than any sound nature was designed to make. The noise is so overwhelming that Evenki herders 60 miles away throw themselves to the ground, thinking the world is ending. In the town of Vanavara, 40 miles south, people are knocked off their feet by what they assume is an earthquake. Then comes the light. The sky fills with a brilliance that makes the sun look dim by comparison. It's not just bright. It's a light that seems to burn through your closed eyelids, a radiance that turns night into day across hundreds of miles. People as far away as England report strange glowing clouds and unusually bright nights for days afterward. The light is visible across half of Asia. A cosmic flashbulb that announces something unprecedented is happening in the Siberian wilderness. The explosion occurs about 5 miles above the forest, which saves the planet from something much worse. Whatever hit the atmosphere, a comet, an asteroid, or something else entirely, never actually reaches the ground. Instead, it detonates in the air with the force of 1,000 atomic bombs, creating a fireball that vaporizes everything within miles and flattens trees across an area larger than Rhode Island. You watch as the shock wave races outward from the explosion point, like a visible wall of destruction. Trees that have stood for centuries are snapped like toothpicks, their trunks sheared off at ground level by winds moving at hundreds of miles per hour. The forest doesn't just fall, it's arranged in a radial pattern, all the trees pointing away from the explosion center like a giant compass made of dead wood. The heat pulse arrives almost simultaneously with the light, intense enough to ignite clothing and skin at distances of dozens of miles. Reindeer herds are incinerated instantly, their bodies found months later reduced to charcoal shadows on the ground. The few Evenki people close enough to witness the event describe their clothing catching fire and their skin blistering from heat that seems to come from the sky itself. What makes this disaster uniquely terrifying is its complete lack of warning. One moment, you're standing in peaceful wilderness. The next, the sky is trying to kill everything below it. There's no gradual build-up, no chance to run or hide, no time to process what's happening. The universe simply decides to demonstrate its power by turning a piece of Siberia into a temporary sun. The seismic effects are registered on instruments around the world. Seismographs in London record the tremors, and atmospheric pressure waves circle the globe multiple times. Weather stations across Europe and Asia report strange fluctuations in barometric pressure that persist for days. The explosion is so powerful that it affects Earth's magnetic field, creating aurora displays visible as far south as the Mediterranean. In the immediate aftermath, an eerie silence settles over the devastated landscape. The explosion has killed or driven away every living thing for miles around, leaving behind a moonscape of flattened trees and scorched earth. The air itself seems different, charged with an energy that makes the hair on your arms stand up. Even the insects have vanished, leaving behind a silence so complete it feels oppressive. The mystery deepens when investigators finally reach the site years later. There's no crater, no meteorite fragments, no physical evidence of what caused the explosion. Just 80 million flattened trees arranged in a perfect radial pattern around an empty center. It's as if something from space decided to knock on Earth's door and then vanished without leaving a calling card. Standing in this cosmic crime scene, surrounded by the aftermath of nature's most violent tantrum, you realize you've witnessed something that challenges human understanding of our place in the universe. The Tunguska event reminds you that space is not empty and peaceful. It's filled with objects moving at incredible speeds, any one of which could end civilization in an instant. The forest will eventually regrow, but the mystery will persist for more than a century, spawning theories ranging from antimatter explosions to alien spacecraft crashes. What's certain is that you've just witnessed the largest impact event in recorded human history, a cosmic reminder that Earth is a very small target in a very large shooting gallery. April 26, 1986, 1:23 a.m., and you've just materialized inside the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Soviet Ukraine. You're standing in the control room of Reactor 4, surrounded by technicians conducting what they believe is a routine safety test. The air hums with the quiet efficiency of modern technology, banks of instruments monitoring the invisible forces contained within the reactor core just below your feet. Everyone here believes they're in complete control of atomic power. In about 30 seconds, they're going to discover just how wrong they are. The control room buzzes with the confident energy of Soviet engineering. Technicians in white coats move between control panels, adjusting dials and monitoring gauges with the casual competence of people who've done this hundreds of times before. The night shift has drawn the assignment of testing the reactor's emergency cooling system, a procedure that should be straightforward and safe. After all, this is the RBMK reactor design, the pride of Soviet nuclear engineering, powering cities across the Eastern Bloc. You notice the small details that history will later identify as warning signs. The reactor is running at unusually low power, creating unstable conditions that make it difficult to control. Several safety systems have been deliberately disabled for the test, removing the multiple backup systems that normally prevent disasters. The reactor operators are pushing the limits of their equipment in ways the designers never intended, driven by pressure to complete the test and get back to normal operations. Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov oversees the test with the arrogance of someone who believes Soviet technology is infallible. He dismisses concerns from younger operators who notice unusual readings on their instruments. When someone suggests postponing the test due to the reactor's unstable condition, Dyatlov refuses, insisting they proceed on schedule. It's a decision that will kill him within months and contaminate half of Europe within hours. At 1:23:40 a.m., Senior Reactor Control Engineer Leonid Topchanov presses the AZ-5 emergency shutdown button, trying to halt the test when power levels spike unexpectedly. It should be the safety measure that prevents disaster. Instead, it becomes the trigger that starts the worst nuclear accident in human history. The control rods that should absorb neutrons and stop the reaction actually cause a massive power surge when they're inserted into the unstable reactor core. The explosion that follows isn't like anything in the movies. There's no mushroom cloud, no dramatic fireball visible from miles away. Instead, you witness something far more terrifying. The invisible killer of radiation being released in quantities that will poison the landscape for centuries. The reactor core literally explodes, blowing the 1,000-ton concrete lid off the reactor building and sending radioactive debris high into the atmosphere. You watch as the control room erupts in confusion and denial. Instruments that should register radiation levels simply max out and stop working, leaving operators blind to the true scale of the catastrophe they've unleashed. Some technicians insist the reactor core is intact, refusing to believe that their sophisticated safety systems have failed so completely. Others stare at readings that don't make sense, trying to process information that contradicts everything they've been taught about nuclear safety. The first responders arrive with no understanding of what they're facing. Firefighters rush toward the burning reactor building with standard equipment designed for ordinary fires, not radioactive infernos. They climb ladders and aim water at flames that are shooting radioactive particles into the night sky with every gust of wind. These men are heroes walking unknowingly into lethal radiation fields, sacrificing their lives to prevent an even worse disaster. Plant Director Viktor Bryukhanov initially refuses to believe the reactor has exploded, insisting to Moscow that the situation is under control. It's a combination of Soviet bureaucratic denial and genuine inability to comprehend the scale of the disaster. How do you report that you've just released more radiation than all previous nuclear accidents combined? How do you explain that a reactor designed to be foolproof has just contaminated thousands of square miles? The invisible nature of the disaster makes it uniquely terrifying. You can't see radiation can't smell it, can't feel it until it's already killing you. People in the nearby city of Pripyat go about their normal Saturday morning routines, completely unaware that they're breathing radioactive particles with every breath. Children play in playgrounds dusted with invisible death. Families plan weekend activities while radiation levels climb to lethal concentrations just miles away. The heroic liquidators begin arriving within hours. Soldiers, miners, and volunteers who will sacrifice their health to contain the disaster. They work in shifts measured in minutes rather than hours, rushing onto the reactor roof to shovel radioactive debris by hand because the radiation is so intense it destroys electronic equipment. Each man can work only briefly before reaching his lifetime radiation exposure limit, creating a conveyor belt of human sacrifice to prevent even worse contamination. You witness the construction of the sarcophagus, the massive concrete shell built to entomb the destroyed reactor. Workers race against time and radiation, pouring concrete and steel around the ruined building while receiving doses of radiation that will kill many of them within months. It's industrial heroism on an unprecedented scale, men building their own monument while the monument kills them. The evacuation of Pripyat begins 36 hours after the explosion. Far too late to prevent massive radiation exposure, but early enough to save thousands of lives. You watch as 36,000 people abandon their homes with only the clothes on their backs, told they'll return in 3 days. They never will. Pripyat becomes a ghost city, frozen in time like a Soviet Pompeii, preserved by radiation instead of volcanic ash. The environmental impact spreads far beyond Ukraine. Radioactive clouds drift across Europe, contaminating farmland in Belarus, causing birth defects in Scandinavia, and forcing the destruction of the contaminated crops as far away as Wales. Reindeer herds in Lapland become too radioactive to eat. Sheep in Scotland are quarantined for years. The disaster demonstrates that nuclear accidents recognize no borders, no political systems, no human attempts to contain their effects. The psychological toll proves as devastating as the physical damage. Entire communities live in fear of invisible contamination, never knowing if their food, water, or air is safe. Children grow up in a landscape where playing outside might be dangerous, where eating local vegetables could cause cancer decades later. The accident creates a generation that understands viscerally that human technology can create problems too large for human solutions. Standing in the ruins of Reactor 4, watching the deadly glow of exposed nuclear fuel, you realize you're witnessing more than just an industrial accident. You're seeing the moment when humanity's confidence in technological progress receives its most severe challenge. Chernobyl becomes a symbol of the unintended consequences of playing with forces beyond human control. A reminder that some mistakes can't be undone, only contained and endured. The exclusion zone around Chernobyl will remain contaminated for centuries, a permanent scar on the landscape that serves as a monument to human hubris and heroism in equal measure. April 18, 1906, 5:12 a.m., and you've just woken up in San Francisco on what seems like a perfectly ordinary Wednesday morning. The city sleeps peacefully around you, fog rolling in from the bay like a soft grey blanket covering the hills. Victorian houses line the streets in neat rows. their ornate wooden facades painted in cheerful colors that will soon be reduced to splinters and ash. You're standing in one of America's most beautiful cities, and in exactly 3 minutes, the Earth is going to remind everyone who's really in charge. San Francisco in 1906 represents the pinnacle of American optimism and industrial achievement. The city has rebuilt itself from the rough mining camp of gold rush days into a sophisticated metropolis that rivals New York and Chicago. Cable cars climb impossibly steep hills, carrying well-dressed passengers to jobs in gleaming office buildings. The Opera House hosts world-class performers, and the restaurants serve cuisine that would impress European visitors. It's a city that believes in progress, technology, and humanity's ability to conquer any challenge nature might present. The morning air carries the familiar sense of a thriving port city. Salt from the bay, coffee from the docks, bread from the bakeries already preparing for the day's business. Newspaper delivery boys begin their routes, carrying headlines about local politics and distant wars that seem far removed from this peaceful California morning. Night shift workers head home, while early risers prepare for another day of building the American dream on the shores of the Pacific. At exactly 5:15 a.m., the San Andreas Fault decides to readjust itself. The earthquake begins with a sound like the world cracking open, a deep, rumbling roar that seems to come from the center of the earth. It's not the gentle swaying that Californians have learned to live with, but a violent shaking that throws people from their beds and turns solid ground into something that moves like ocean waves. The initial shock lasts only 40 seconds, but those 40 seconds redefine what's possible when the earth decides to move. You watch as San Francisco's carefully constructed civilization collapses in real time. Victorian houses, built on filled marshland that seemed solid until this moment, pancake into themselves as their foundations liquefy. The ornate facades that gave the city its distinctive character crumble like elaborate sandcastles hit by an invisible tide. Chimneys topple through roofs, crushing families who thought masonry meant safety. The human drama unfolds in countless individual tragedies. Families rush from collapsing buildings carrying whatever they can grab. Children, photo albums, the family cat, while leaving behind lifetimes of accumulated possessions. A mother searches frantically for her child in the rubble of what was their bedroom moments before. An elderly man sits in his nightclothes on what remains of his front steps, staring at the pile of lumber that used to be his home. But the earthquake is just the opening act in San Francisco's disaster drama. The real destroyer arrives in the form of fire, sparked by broken gas lines, overturned stoves, and downed electrical wires. Within hours, dozens of separate fires begin burning throughout the city, and the earthquake has broken the water mains that firefighters need to combat the flames. It's a perfect storm of destruction. First, the earthquake destroys the buildings and infrastructure. Then fire consumes whatever survives the shaking. Fire Chief Dennis Sullivan, one of the few men who understood how vulnerable San Francisco was to earthquake-caused fires, dies in the initial collapse of his firehouse. His death removes the one person who might have organized an effective firefighting response, leaving the city's fire department leaderless at the moment they're needed most. Without water pressure and without their chief, firefighters resort to desperate measures, including dynamiting buildings to create fire breaks. The dynamiting strategy backfires spectacularly. Most of the firefighters have no experience with explosives, and their amateur demolition work often spreads fires rather than stopping them. Buildings that survived the earthquake are blown apart by well-meaning rescuers, and the explosions scatter burning debris across wider areas. The cure becomes worse than the disease, turning controlled demolition into accelerated destruction. You witness the strange social dynamics that emerge during disasters. Class distinctions temporarily disappear as wealthy socialites and working-class immigrants work side by side to fight fires and rescue survivors. Nob Hill mansions burn alongside Chinatown tenements, proving that Catastrophe is remarkably democratic in its destruction. Some of the city's most prominent citizens find themselves homeless and grateful for bread lines organized by people they would have ignored just days before. The fires burned for 3 days, consuming over 28,000 buildings and leaving more than half the city's population homeless. The flames are so intense they create their own weather system, generating winds that spread the fire faster than people can flee. Witnesses described seeing furniture and even entire buildings lifted into the air by fire-generated tornadoes, creating a hellscape that looks more like a medieval vision of the apocalypse than a modern American city. General Frederick Funston declares martial law and orders his troops to shoot looters on sight, creating additional chaos in a city already overwhelmed by natural disaster. Soldiers patrol streets filled with refugees, adding the threat of summary execution to the existing dangers of fire, falling buildings, and smoke inhalation. Some historians argue that more people died from trigger-happy soldiers than from actual looting, but accurate records are impossible to maintain during such widespread destruction. The refugee camps that spring up in Golden Gate Park and the Presidio become temporary cities housing over 200,000 displaced people. Families who owned mansions the week before now live in tents alongside servants and laborers, all reduced to the same basic need for shelter and food. The camps develop their own economies, governments, and social structures, creating communities that will persist for months while the city rebuilds. But here's the remarkable thing about the San Francisco earthquake. It doesn't destroy the city's spirit. Within days of the disaster, residents are already planning reconstruction. The same optimism that built San Francisco in the first place now focuses on building it better. Architects arrive from around the country with plans for wider streets, better building codes, and improved infrastructure. The disaster becomes an opportunity to fix problems that had accumulated over decades of rapid growth. The rebuilding transforms San Francisco into a more beautiful and more resilient city. The new buildings incorporate earthquake-resistant design principles learned from studying what survived and what didn't. Streets are widened and straightened, creating the grid system that still defines much of the city today. Building codes become some of the strictest in the nation, establishing standards that will help the city survive future earthquakes. Standing in the ruins of what was once America's most beautiful city, watching survivors organize relief efforts while smoke still rises from the rubble, you realize you're witnessing more than just natural disaster recovery. You're seeing the birth of modern earthquake science, disaster preparedness, and urban planning. The San Francisco earthquake becomes the disaster that teaches America how to build cities that can survive nature's worst tantrums, creating knowledge that will save thousands of lives in future earthquakes. July 14, 1789, and you've just materialized in Paris on what will become history's most famous bad hair day. You're standing in the shadow of the Bastille fortress, watching an angry mob gather with the kind of energy that makes sensible people find somewhere else to be. The air crackles with revolutionary fervor and the unmistakable scent of unwashed bodies pressed together in common cause. You're about to witness the moment when an entire social order decides to commit suicide by guillotine. The Paris around you seethes with barely contained rage that's been building for decades. Bread costs more than most people earn in a day, while aristocrats throw parties that cost more than entire villages see in a year. The streets overflow with pamphlets demanding liberty, equality, and fraternity, though nobody's quite figured out what those concepts actually mean in practice. What they do know is that the current system isn't working, and they're ready to try something new, even if that something involves considerably more blood than anyone initially planned. You watch as the crowd grows larger and angrier, fed by rumors that the king is planning to crush the newly formed National Assembly with foreign troops. The Bastille represents everything the people hate about the old regime: royal authority, arbitrary imprisonment, and the power to disappear inconvenient citizens without trial. Never mind that the fortress currently holds only 7 prisoners, most of them common criminals. Symbols matter more than reality when you're starting a revolution. The storming of the Bastille begins with demands for gunpowder and quickly escalates into urban warfare. You witness ordinary citizens, shopkeepers, artisans, laborers, transform into a revolutionary army armed with whatever weapons they can find. Kitchen knives, farming tools, and hunting rifles become instruments of political change as the mob overwhelms the fortress guards through sheer numbers and desperate courage. Governor Bernard-René de Launay tries to negotiate, but negotiation requires both sides to speak the same language, and revolution speaks only in absolutes. When the fortress falls, the mob doesn't just celebrate victory, they demonstrate what revolutionary justice looks like. Delaunay's head ends up on a pike, carried through the streets as a trophy that announces the old rules no longer apply. It's a preview of coming attractions in a revolution that will make beheading into performance art. The success at the Bastille unleashes something that had been building in French society for generations: the intoxicating realization that ordinary people can overthrow their supposed betters through organized violence. The psychological barrier between subjects and rulers dissolves in a matter of hours, replaced by the dangerous knowledge that authority exists only as long as people choose to recognize it. You follow the revolutionary energy as it spreads through Paris like a contagion of liberation. Aristocrats who had spent their lives confident in their God-given superiority suddenly find themselves hiding in cellars or fleeing the country with whatever portable wealth they can carry. The elaborate social hierarchies that had seemed as permanent as natural law crumble with shocking speed, proving that civilization is far more fragile than anyone wants to admit. The early days of the revolution pulse with genuine idealism and hope. The Declaration of the Rights of Man promises liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression for all citizens. The feudal system that had dominated French society for centuries is abolished with a stroke of the pen. For a brief shining moment, it seems like reason and justice might actually triumph over tradition and privilege. But revolutions have their own logic, and that logic tends toward increasing extremism. The moderate leaders who initially guided the revolution find themselves pushed aside by more radical voices who argue that half measures aren't enough. If some violence was necessary to overthrow the old regime, then more violence must be needed to protect the new one from its enemies. The revolution begins eating its own children with the methodical efficiency of a well-organized slaughterhouse. Maximilien Robespierre emerges as the revolution's most articulate advocate for virtue through violence. He speaks eloquently about creating a republic of virtue, where citizens will be free, equal, and moral. The problem is that achieving this virtuous society apparently requires killing everyone who might disagree with it. Robespierre's logic is impeccable and terrifying. If you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And problems get solved with the guillotine. The guillotine itself becomes the revolution's most iconic symbol, a machine that promises democratic equality in death. Rich or poor, noble or commoner, everyone gets the same quick, clean execution. It's remarkably egalitarian for an instrument of state murder, reflecting the revolution's commitment to treating all citizens equally, at least in their final moments. The crowds that gather to watch executions treat them like entertainment, bringing picnic lunches and cheering for their favorite victims. Daily life during the terror becomes a surreal combination of paranoia and revolutionary enthusiasm. Neighbors inform on neighbors for insufficient revolutionary zeal. Speaking fondly of the old days can earn you a trip to the guillotine. Even revolutionary leaders sleep uneasily, knowing that yesterday's hero can become tomorrow's traitor, based on shifting political winds and personal grudges dressed up as ideological purity. You witness the revolution's strange relationship with violence and virtue. The same people who speak passionately about human rights and dignity spend their afternoons watching public executions. Revolutionary festivals celebrate reason and brotherhood, while the guillotine works overtime in nearby squares. It's as if the revolution believes it can create a peaceful, just society by killing everyone who might prevent peace and justice. The irony becomes increasingly obvious as the revolution progresses. The fight against tyranny creates new forms of tyranny more efficient than anything the old regime ever managed. The Committee of Public Safety, established to protect the revolution, becomes more feared than the royal secret police ever were. Revolutionary tribunals dispense justice so quickly that trials become mere formalities before predetermined executions. The revolution eventually consumes Robespierre himself, proving that revolutionary logic leads inevitably to self-destruction. The man who had orchestrated thousands of executions in the name of virtue finds himself facing the same guillotine he had fed so enthusiastically. His death marks the end of the terror, but not before the revolution demonstrates just how quickly civilization can unravel when people decide that their political ideals justify unlimited violence. Standing in the blood-soaked streets of revolutionary Paris, watching idealism transform into systematic murder, you realize you're witnessing more than just political change. You're seeing the birth of modern totalitarianism, the dangerous idea that creating a perfect society justifies eliminating imperfect people. The French Revolution becomes history's most influential example of how the pursuit of liberty can lead directly to tyranny, and how quickly noble ideals can become excuses for ignoble actions. The revolution that promised to liberate humanity ends up demonstrating humanity's capacity for organized self-destruction in the name of the highest principles. October 8, 1871, and you've just arrived in Chicago on what should have been another ordinary Sunday evening. Instead, you're standing in a city that's about to become the largest campfire in American history. The air feels unnaturally dry for autumn, and the wooden sidewalks beneath your feet seem to creak with anticipation. Chicago has been suffering through one of the driest summers on record, with barely an inch of rain falling in 3 months. The entire city has become a perfectly seasoned tinderbox, just waiting for someone to strike a match. The Chicago around you represents everything ambitious about 19th century America. Wooden buildings stretch as far as you can see, from humble immigrant cottages to grand mansions on the north side. The sidewalks are wooden, the streets are paved with wooden blocks, and even the roofs are covered with wooden shingles. It's a city built from the forests of Michigan and Wisconsin, transported by ship and rail to create the fastest growing metropolis in the world. You're standing near the O'Leary cottage on DeKoven Street, where the most famous myth in American disaster history is about to be born. Contrary to what generations of school children will learn, Mrs. O'Leary's cow did not kick over a lantern while being milked. That story was invented by a Chicago reporter who thought the truth was too boring for his readers. The real cause of the fire remains a mystery, but what's certain is that around 9 p.m., flames begin consuming the O'Leary barn with enthusiasm that suggests the wood has been soaked in kerosene. The fire starts small, as most disasters do. A few flames licking at hay and wooden barn walls. Nothing that couldn't be handled with some buckets of water and quick thinking. But this is Chicago in 1871, where the fire department is exhausted from fighting blazes all week, and the alarm system is about to fail in the worst possible way. The initial fire alarm sends firefighters to the wrong location, giving the flames precious time to spread beyond easy control. You watch as the fire discovers just how flammable Chicago really is. The wooden buildings catch with frightening speed, flames dancing from roof to roof with the deadly grace of a predator stalking its prey. The narrow alleys between tenements become wind tunnels that feed the fire with fresh oxygen while carrying burning debris to start new blazes blocks away from the original source. The wind becomes the fire's most powerful ally. Gusts from the southwest push the flames toward the heart of the city with relentless determination, turning what should have been a neighborhood fire into an urban catastrophe. Burning pieces of wood and debris fly through the air like deadly confetti, starting spot fires faster than firefighters can extinguish them. The wind doesn't just spread the fire, it creates a firestorm that generates its own weather system. Chicago's fire department, already depleted from fighting smaller fires throughout the week, faces an impossible task. Their steam-powered fire engines require time to build pressure, and by the time they arrive at the scene, the fire has grown beyond the capacity of their equipment to handle. The wooden water mains buried beneath wooden streets begin burning, cutting off the water supply just when firefighters need it most. You witness the strange priorities people reveal during disasters. Wealthy families on the north side spend precious hours trying to save heavy furniture while abandoning valuable jewelry and documents. Some people bury their possessions in their yards, not realizing that the fire will burn so hot it will bake the earth and destroy anything buried in it. Others load their belongings onto wagons and flee toward the lake, creating traffic jams that trap families in the path of the advancing flames. The fire creates its own twisted marketplace of desperation. Wagon drivers demand fortunes to help evacuate belongings. boat owners on the Chicago River charge premium prices to ferry refugees across the water. Opportunistic vendors sell lake water at prices that would make modern price gougers weep with admiration. Disaster brings out both the best and worst in human nature, sometimes in the same person within the span of an hour. As the fire spreads toward downtown, it begins consuming Chicago's proudest achievements. The post office, built to be fireproof, burns when its wooden window frames catch fire and spread flames to the interior. The Palmer House Hotel, one of the city's most luxurious establishments, disappears in a matter of hours. Even the Waterworks building, constructed of stone and supposedly immune to fire, succumbs when its wooden roof catches fire and spreads flames throughout the structure. The human drama unfolds in countless acts of heroism and tragedy. Families flee with whatever they can carry, often making heartbreaking choices about what to save and what to abandon. Children clutch dolls and pets, while parents struggle with bundles of clothes and food. Elderly residents who can't move quickly enough are carried by neighbors, creating touching scenes of community solidarity amid the chaos. The fire burns for 3 days, consuming over 17,000 buildings and leaving 300 people dead and 100,000 homeless. When it finally dies out, more from lack of fuel than human intervention, it leaves behind a moonscape of ash and twisted metal, where a thriving city had stood just days before. But here's the remarkable thing about the Great Chicago Fire. It becomes the disaster that makes Chicago great. The city that rises from the ashes incorporates new building technologies, fire-resistant materials, and improved urban planning. The fire clears away decades of hasty construction and poor planning, creating space for architects like Louis Sullivan and Daniel Burnham to reimagine what an American city could be. Standing in the smoke-filled ruins of what was once America's fastest-growing city, you realize you're witnessing urban rebirth through catastrophe. Sometimes progress requires a clean slate written in ash and flame. April 10th, 1815, Indonesian island of Sumbawa, and you're standing beneath what appears to be just another peaceful tropical mountain, one that's about to rewrite global weather patterns. Mount Tambora rises peacefully above lush forests and fertile villages, its slopes covered with the kind of vegetation that thrives in volcanic soil. The air smells of frangipani and wood smoke from cooking fires, while children play in villages that have existed for generations in the mountain's benevolent shadow. You're witnessing the calm before the storm that will change global weather patterns and inspire Mary Shelley to write Frankenstein. The local Tambora people go about their daily routines with no idea they're living on top of the most dangerous mountain on earth. Women tend gardens that flourish in the rich volcanic soil, while men fish in coastal waters warmed by tropical currents. The mountain has been quiet for centuries, long enough for people to forget that volcanoes can do more than provide fertile farmland. They see Tambora as a generous provider, not a sleeping giant with the power to plunge the world into artificial winter. The mountain has been rumbling intermittently for 3 years, but nobody connects these minor earthquakes to the catastrophe that's building beneath their feet. Small tremors are common in Indonesia, where tectonic plates meet and grind against each other with geological regularity. The local people have learned to live with the Earth's occasional restlessness, not understanding that this time, the restlessness is building towards something unprecedented. At 7 p.m. on April 10th, Tambora clears its throat with an explosion heard 800 miles away. The initial eruption sends a column of ash and gas 15 miles into the atmosphere, visible from neighboring islands as a towering pillar of darkness against the tropical sky. But this is just the warm-up act for a volcanic performance that will make Vesuvius look like a firecracker. You watch as the mountain slopes empty of people fleeing the ashfall and pumice rain. Entire villages abandon their homes, carrying whatever they can manage, while volcanic debris falls like hail around them. The lucky ones reach boats and flee to neighboring islands. The unlucky ones are caught in pyroclastic flows that race down the mountainside at speeds that make escape impossible. For 5 days, Tambora continues its preliminary show, lulling observers into thinking they've seen the worst of it. Ash falls across the region, and the mountain glows with internal fire visible from dozens of miles away. But the real show is still building in the magma chamber beneath the mountain, where pressure accumulates like a geological pressure cooker approaching its breaking point. April 15th arrives with the force of geological apocalypse. At 7 p.m., Tambora explodes with a sound heard 1,200 miles away in Sumatra. The eruption column reaches 25 miles into the atmosphere, punching through the stratosphere and injecting massive quantities of ash and sulfur compounds directly into the global air circulation system. You're witnessing the birth of the first truly global environmental disaster of the modern era. The explosion is so violent it removes 4,000 feet from the mountain's height, creating a caldera 4 miles wide where the peak used to be. Pyroclastic flows race outward at hundreds of miles per hour, instantly killing every living thing within a 40-mile radius. The flows are so hot they boil seawater when they reach the coast, creating massive steam explosions that add their own contribution to the atmospheric chaos. The immediate death toll is staggering. Entire kingdoms on Sumbawa vanish overnight, their populations killed by pyroclastic flows or buried under pumice deposits dozens of feet deep. The neighboring island of Lombok loses thousands of residents to ashfalls and tsunamis generated by pyroclastic flows hitting the sea. Ships sailing hundreds of miles away report ash falling on their decks and compasses spinning wildly from the volcanic electromagnetic effects. But the real disaster is just beginning as Tambora's eruption creates the year without a summer across the globe. The massive quantities of sulfur compounds injected into the stratosphere create a planetary sunscreen, reflecting solar radiation back into space and dropping global temperatures by several degrees. It doesn't sound like much, but those few degrees are enough to disrupt weather patterns across the entire planet. The volcanic winter hits the northern hemisphere with devastating effect. The summer of 1816 becomes the coldest on record, with a frost occurring in July and August across New England and Europe. Crops fail on a massive scale as growing seasons shrink and temperatures drop below survival levels for most food plants. What should have been harvest season becomes a desperate struggle for survival as entire regions face famine. You witness the global social upheaval that follows climate disaster. In New England, farmers abandon their ruined crops and migrate westward in unprecedented numbers, accelerating American expansion and contributing to the settlement of the Ohio Valley. In Europe, failed harvests trigger social unrest and contribute to political instability that will shape the continent for decades. The famine creates waves of migration as people flee regions where food has become impossible to grow. Irish peasants, already living on the edge of subsistence, face starvation when potato crops fail in the cold, wet conditions. Chinese farmers abandon their fields when monsoon patterns shift and traditional growing seasons collapse. The disaster demonstrates how interconnected human civilization has become with stable climate patterns. In Switzerland, the cold, gloomy summer of 1816 traps a group of English writers indoors at Villa Diodati, near Lake Geneva. Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, Mary Shelley, and John Polidori spend their time telling ghost stories to pass the endless rainy days. Mary Shelley's contribution to their literary competition becomes Frankenstein, a novel that explores themes of creation and destruction that seem particularly appropriate for a year when nature has demonstrated its power to unmake human civilization. The strange weather phenomena continue for years. Spectacular sunsets caused by volcanic particles in the atmosphere inspire artists across Europe and America. The Hudson River School painters capture skies of unusual colors and dramatic cloud formations that result directly from Tambora's continuing atmospheric effects. Even art becomes a record of the disaster's global reach. Standing on this Indonesian mountainside, watching the eruption that will change weather patterns across the planet, you realize you're witnessing the birth of the modern understanding of global environmental interconnection. Tambora demonstrates that local disasters can have planetary consequences, that events in remote locations can affect weather, agriculture, and human society on the other side of the world. The eruption kills more than 70,000 people directly, but its indirect effects through climate change and famine kill hundreds of thousands more across the globe, making it one of the deadliest volcanic eruptions in recorded history. And suddenly, you wake up. You're back in your own bed, surrounded by the familiar comfort of your bedroom in the 21st century. The pillow beneath your head isn't filled with volcanic ash or plague-infested straw. The air you're breathing doesn't smell of smoke, molasses, or radiation. Your biggest decision isn't whether to flee from pyroclastic flows or revolutionary mobs, but whether to watch another video or finally get some sleep. You look around at what modern people call disasters. Your phone battery is at 15%, a minor inconvenience that would have seemed like magic to someone fleeing the Great Fire of London. The Wi-Fi is running slowly, which would have amazed medieval scholars who spent lifetimes copying single manuscripts by hand. You're out of your favorite coffee, a problem that would have seemed laughably trivial to someone rationing food during the year without a summer. The heating bill arrived today, and it's higher than expected. But you're not chopping furniture for fuel while fleeing advancing ice sheets. Your commute was delayed by construction, but you weren't navigating streets filled with molasses or dodging guillotines operated by enthusiastic revolutionaries. The grocery store was out of your preferred brand of bread, but there was still bread, and nobody was rioting over grain shortages or dying of ergot poisoning. Your worst modern disasters are mostly inconveniences that previous generations would have considered miraculous luxuries. The power went out for 3 hours last month, and you complained about missing your favorite show. People in medieval Europe lived their entire lives without electric lighting and considered themselves fortunate if they had enough candles for special occasions. Your internet connection drops occasionally, interrupting your access to the sum total of human knowledge. something that would have made the scholars of Baghdad weep with joy before the Mongols burned their libraries. Even your genuine problems pale in comparison to the disasters you've just witnessed. Yes, modern life has stress, but it's the stress of abundance rather than survival. You worry about career advancement, not whether you'll live to see another sunrise. You debate restaurant choices, not whether the bread you're eating might be contaminated with plague bacteria. You complain about traffic jams, not about fleeing your burning city with only the clothes on your back. The safety systems surrounding your daily life would seem miraculous to disaster survivors throughout history. Building codes ensure your house won't collapse in minor earthquakes. Fire departments respond within minutes, not hours or days. Weather forecasts warn you about storms days in advance, instead of leaving you to discover hurricanes when they arrive. Emergency services exist specifically to help you during crises, rather than leaving you to fend for yourself while the world burns around you. Your pillow won't catch fire, flood, or emit radiation. The roof over your head was built to modern safety standards that account for lessons learned from thousands of historical disasters. The water from your tap is cleaner than what royalty drank for most of human history. The food in your refrigerator is safer than what the wealthy ate in the finest restaurants of previous centuries. You live in an era when humanity has learned, sometimes at terrible cost, how to build cities that don't burn down completely, how to construct buildings that don't collapse in earthquakes, how to create warning systems for natural disasters, and how to respond to emergencies with coordinated professional help rather than panicked amateur efforts. So here's the question that's probably keeping you awake now. If you absolutely had to choose one of these disasters to time travel to, which would it be? And let me say up front, none of them is a perfectly valid answer. There's no shame in preferring your boring, safe, modern existence to any of history's greatest hits of human suffering. Maybe you choose Pompeii for the chance to see ancient Roman life, accepting the risk of volcanic death for a glimpse of classical civilization. Perhaps the Titanic appeals to you. At least you'd experience luxury accommodations before the iceberg arrives. And if you're lucky enough to survive, you'd have one hell of a story. The Boston Molasses Flood might tempt you with its sheer absurdity. How many people can say they witnessed death by dessert ingredient? Or maybe you're drawn to the intellectual tragedy of Baghdad, watching centuries of human knowledge turn to ash, or the cosmic mystery of Tunguska, witnessing an explosion that still puzzles scientists today. Each disaster offers its own terrible fascination, its own unique glimpse into how quickly human civilization can crumble when nature or human folly decides to intervene. But honestly, the more I think about it, the more grateful I am for our modern disasters. Slow internet, expensive coffee, and phones that need charging. These are the problems of a species that has largely solved the basic challenges of survival, at least for those of us fortunate enough to live in the developed world in the 21st century. Let me know in the comments which disaster you choose, if forced to pick one. Or tell me about the modern disasters that seem ridiculous compared to what we've witnessed tonight. What's your worst first world problem that would have seemed like a miracle to someone fleeing the Black Death or the Great Fire of London? And if you enjoyed this morbid journey through history's worst days, subscribe for more gentle explorations of humanity's darker moments. Sweet dreams, and remember, your pillow is significantly safer than anything people slept on during most of human history.